Qigong is an energetic practice which seeks to combine whole body movement, mental focus and attention, and specific breathing techniques in order to enhance both mental and physical health. So Qigong, not terribly well known in the West. Counterpart art, Tai Chi, far better known. There are similarities which I'll discuss in a minute. If we want to know what Qigong is, one of the best ways probably is to actually understand what the words Qi and Gong mean. So we often run into difficulties when dealing with Chinese terms which have no direct correspondence in English. Primarily we hit that obstacle with the word Qi itself. Qi's been translated in many different ways over centuries. It's commonly given as meaning air or breath or energy. It doesn't really mean any of those things. If we look at the Chinese ideogram, so the pictorial language, which character that stands for Qi, that probably gives us a good way in to understanding exactly what it does mean. So originally the character equated to vapor, which gives you some sense of the insubstantial, ephemeral nature of it. In other words, the fact that there is not something concrete we can point to and say, that's Qi there. Over time, the ideogram developed to have a bowl of rice placed underneath the character for vapor, which then implies that there is a nutritional element to it. In other words, this vaporous substance is arising from or coming out of something which is good for you, something that helps the body in its natural progressions and work. So that's Qi. Qi also is further complicated by the fact that it is now neither noun nor verb, but both. So Qi can be understood in many different senses. The second part of the term, Gong, is often translated as work, but more accurately implies skill. In other words, something that one develops over time through working with to become effective in using. Qi has this sense of the life force. So in other words, it's something that all living beings possess, and if you like, it's the kind of driving substance behind them, what animates, what motivates people. So we can understand why the translation of breath has become so prevalent. Often people will say it's breath work or energy work. It's somewhere in between those two things. In wider terms, it's worth noting that the actual phrase Qigong did not exist for a long time. It only was kind of coined and became common currency somewhere around the 1950s. And this was because it was used to bring together a lot of different strands in Chinese culture, philosophy and body practice, which all had run in various permutations for many centuries. I mean, the original practice, although no one is entirely sure, is at least several thousand years old, possibly older, depending upon which authority you wish to follow. So the term Qigong comes into practice round about then, as I say, of a way of pulling together all these different strands. And this is quite important when we're thinking about what is the Qigong that we learn and practice, particularly in the West. China, obviously a huge geographical area, with many bordering nations and a very rich and complex cultural heritage that develops over a long period of time. And it's not surprising that these various influences come to bear on the practice of what we now think of as Qigong. So we have a lot of different strands of influence. We have the native kind of religious and spiritual practices, which are normally referred to as Taoism or Taoism. And then alongside that, there's the more kind of earthy, kind of ethical practices known as Confucianism. And then we have strong influence of Buddhism, from India originally and then being developed within China itself. The sheer range of the country means that you have influences of Buddhism coming from India, from Tibet, from nations further in Southeast Asia. And all of these influences have slightly different emphasis. They have, whilst they share a common kind of root belief, they develop in different ways and they emphasize different things. So Qigong manages to pull all these different influences together. And it develops in a lot of different ways. In other words, Qigong can be seen in cultural artifacts and in a lot of different practices. So the primary practices are basically three different strands. So there is a strong connection with what's often referred to as TCM, or traditional Chinese medicine. Then there's a more spiritual, devotional aspect, which has strong links, obviously, to the Taoist and the Buddhist sides of this. And then there is a strong relationship with the long tradition of martial arts in China. And Qigong develops and influences and works with these three different strands. And it tends to go off down different paths. So in other words, Qigong practitioner could be seeking enlightenment in a temple up in the mountains, could be attempting to heal sick members of the community, or could be working with very advanced, complex and quite ferocious martial arts techniques. All three of these things are Qigong. For our purposes, we're looking mainly at a series of physical, energetic practices that seek to enhance physical, mental well-being. It's similar to yoga in the respect that we are primarily in the West, for what we call Qigong, is this series of movements that we learn, some very simple, some quite complex, with an emphasis on learning to integrate whole body movement. That's one strand of it. Second strand of it is breathing practice. So there are a lot of different systems of breathing which we use in Qigong. And one of the primary aims is to integrate the postural and structural work of the body alongside the correct breathing. The third part of our kind of triangle of practice, if you like, is what the Chinese refer to as Yi, Y-I. So Yi, again, is another word with no direct translation into English, but has aspects and connotations of purpose, intention. In other words, it's the more mental aspect of it. So Qigong needs to be performed with a large investment of mental focus, clarity and intention, where we are seeking specific aims from the movements and forms we're learning. When you get this whole body movement, the control of the breath and the use or development of the Yi working together, then we are effectively practicing Qigong. And as I say, once you've done this, you can then take it down specific paths, whether that be an interest in the body energetics of ideas such as the meridians, familiar to most people from acupuncture, for healing purposes, or the more advanced internal work, which is sometimes known as Neigong, which is effectively very related to Buddhist meditation practices and seeks spiritual enlightenment, a return to the true self, as they often say. Or it can be developed into very powerful martial arts techniques. For my purposes, when I'm teaching, I'm not trying to particularly point anyone in any of those directions. I'm bringing together practices and exercises which have developed across many hundreds, if not thousands, of different schools of Qigong in China over the centuries, which I think best exemplify some of the core concerns, and also obviously trying to work with techniques that people in the West who have little experience of these notions find it easy to grasp. So Tai Chi, as I mentioned before, is kind of much more well known in the West, and a question that's often asked is Tai Chi the same as Qi Gong? It's an interesting question, and you can answer it in several different ways, and I don't think you would be entirely right with any of the answers. Effectively, Tai Chi is a branch or form of Qi Gong. It shares exactly the same ideas and concerns about how we use the body's natural energetics and how we can develop them. But it's a much more complex and ornate form of Qigong, with the obvious aspect that it is also, and this is overlooked by many people, effectively a martial art. It's not often taught as a martial art. It can be taught purely as a series of very beautiful physical forms and practices that flow in a long sequence. And again, there are many different schools and styles of Tai Chi. You could look at several different ones and actually imagine that the practitioner is doing something completely different. But it's what we call application. So Tai Chi has application form for self-defense, basically. Qigong doesn't. I often try and use the concept of saying, if you think about Tai Chi being a very long sentence with many clauses, we could perhaps think about Qigong as being some of the grammatical terms and some of the words that go together to form those sentences. It's much easier to practice Qigong than Tai Chi. Because of its holistic nature, the benefits of Qigong are numerous. It doesn't only work on the physical, structural level of the body, but as importantly and significantly works with the mental capacities and one's emotional well-being as well. It's very much a holistic system, insofar as the belief is that the body and the mind cannot be separated, and the health of one is very much dependent upon the other. Depending upon how one approaches the practices, whether one's putting emphasis on the physical alignment and postural work or on the more meditational internal work, one can direct the positive benefits of it towards a variety of aims. Many studies have been carried out over the past 50 years to show how efficient it is in dealing with a range of symptoms. To give a rough idea of the kind of broad range of things we're talking about, there are studies showing it has had remarkable practical effect in helping sufferers from asthma, insomnia, blood circulation issues. Performing many of the Qigong routines that we learn is a slow process, so the exercises are done very softly and very gently, with a great concern for focused clarity over a long period of time. The idea being that as long as one aligns oneself to the practice correctly, one cannot help but gain benefits. The emphasis on Yi, which I referred to before, this idea of attention or mental clarity when performing exercises, alongside the very slow and controlled breathing practices, helps take one into what's often referred to as the relaxation state. Once we are there, the benefits are numerous. The body begins to function more efficiently, and many of the processes that we take for granted, such as peristalsis, digestion, blood cell growth, blood flow, can often become affected by old age, infirmity and ill health over time. These processes are regenerated and become much more vigorous and work in a more natural fashion with the Qigong practice. One of the most obvious benefits is gained in terms of the body's structural alignment and the muscular and skeletal control. Qigong is very interested in the fascia within the body, i.e. the kind of wetsuit that lies beneath the skin that ties everything together and interacts with the mind in order to allow us to perform any physical movements whatsoever. Key to successful Qigong practice is a Chinese term called sung. Again, we run into issues of translation, but it effectively means letting go or relaxation. This doesn't mean becoming limp and ineffectual, but it means rather learning to consciously become aware of tension and bad practices that become ingrained in the body over the time, and then using the mind, the breath, and the control of the body to help release this tension. People often come to Qi Gong because they have specific problems which they would like to address. As an example, we can look at issues with joints. In particular, people, as they become older, often have problems with knee motility and flexibility. And it's interesting to note that several studies in America have shown that Qi Gong is actually a far more effective response to such issues than running or jogging. Because it avoids high impact exercise, it encourages the natural growth and power and efficiency of the joints. One of the immediate positives for Qigong practice is that it does not require you to have what in the West we might conventionally call a huge degree of body fitness. In other words, it can be effectively practiced by the very elderly, by the very young, by the infirm, and even those who have actual physical impairment. Because we focus as much on the mind and the breath as well as the physical practices, it's ideal for anyone who suffers from such issues and challenges.